Hello, I'm the awesome Tutor, and today we're going to be looking at the significance of global imbalances. By imbalances, we mean, of course, imbalances within the current account, within the financial account, within the capital account. Okay, but for A level, questions are mainly based around the current account when it comes to the balance of payments. So, if you have a deficit in one country, whether it's a current account deficit or a trade deficit or a financial account deficit, whatever, and that means you're going to have a surplus somewhere else. So if one country has a deficit, say a trade deficit, then another country is going to have a trade surplus, another country around the world. So if one country also has a surplus, therefore, then another country must also have a trade deficit. Okay? If you don't understand how or why, watch my first video on the balance of payments. Okay, so what this does is you have a country with a surplus, a country with a deficit. That creates tensions. International tensions. You know any examples of this? The US-China trade war. Okay, the USA runs a persistent current account deficit, particularly in the balance of trade. China, however, runs a current account surplus, again, mainly due to the trade surplus that it has. So the USA with China has a trade deficit. China with the USA has a trade surplus. Now the USA, there's many US critics which accuse China of currency manipulation. They accuse China of devaluing or undervaluing its exchange rate, because what that does is if its exchange rate remains low, the price of its exports are low, so its exports are more price competitive. So with these global imbalances, they lead to tensions between countries, accusations, political conflict, etc. So what Trump has done as a result to rectify this imbalance between the USA and China, Trump has imposed protectionist measures. So one significant consequence of global imbalances is a protectionist sentiment, or even it may lead to protectionist measures. Now, what's a good diagram to draw for this? The tariff diagram. Okay, have your demand, your supply, that's your output. Remember your price. So this is obviously domestic supply and demand. So here we have the price world. So price of goods and services with open free trade. Okay? Supply world. What happens if you impose tariffs? It increases this price and decreases the supply world. So you have supply world plus tariff, price world plus tariff. So I'm going to draw some quantities here. I'm not going to go into too much detail in explaining the tariff diagram because that's for a separate video. I don't want to make this video drag on too long. My videos have a tendency to go on too long. So, the imports decrease from Q4 minus Q1 to Q3 minus Q2. Okay, but let's look at the negatives. And let's look at this from a more international perspective. Okay, USA imposes tariffs. What happens? Retaliation. China imposes retaliatory tariffs. Okay, you want some statistics? The USA's tariffs on China now total is about 50% of total imports from China. China's retaliatory tariffs on the USA now total about 70% of the value of US imports into China. So that retaliation, of course, both countries experience this, the consequences and the ramifications of this tariff diagram. So we have a welfare loss here. So it's really the consumers that become disadvantaged from these protectionist measures. Welfare loss shown by these two triangles. Obviously prices increase, cost of production, cost push inflation, standards of living may be deteriorated because of lack of imports. Maybe those imports are necessary to increase your standard of living. What else do we have? Also, consumer choice and variety decreases. And a very important thing about these tariffs and protectionist measures is it's a threat to globalization. Okay, because these protectionist measures, they distort a country's comparative advantage. Okay? If we don't understand these terms, these are from different parts of the specification, so I might cover them in a different video. But you should know what globalization means. It's fairly simple. So forget comparative advantage if you don't understand it. It's a threat to globalization because if both countries impose tariffs and impose protectionist measures, the total volume of trade decreases between the two countries. So world output decreases, and that negatively impacts globalization. So really the best point you could make to do with the significance of global imbalances is this protectionist sentiment or protectionist measures. Alright, I'm going to go into maybe two more points. Alright, another point you could use, although I would mainly rely on your protectionist point in an essay, is global imbalances may lead to the creation of asset bubbles. Okay? Countries which have a surplus on the current account. What can they do with that extra foreign currency? They can use it to build up their reserves, they can loan it out to other countries, or they can invest it abroad. And that's exactly what Chinese investors are doing in the UK property market. UK has a current account deficit. China has a current account surplus. And so you have an excess of foreign currency in China. And so what many investors in China do is they invest into the UK property market. What that does is it creates an asset bubble. And so with all this investment, I don't know how to spell bubble. With all this investment, house prices shoot up. And that has significant ramifications because housing becomes less affordable for the average person in the UK. So poverty levels go up, the amount of homeless people goes up. Okay? And also, that's part of the reason why London is so expensive to live there. And what does that do? It leads to geographic immobility of labor. Remember from last year in Macroeconomics, AS? Geographic immobility of labor, which is a form of market failure. Because it's hard for people to live in London because it's so expensive. Okay? It's hard to attract people to essential jobs such as teachers, nurses, police officers. You have a geographic immobility of labor, and that's market failure. Okay? And actually this global imbalance is very significant because 85% of newly built property in London is actually sold to international investors. Okay? And most of them don't even use the property. So what happens is we end up with empty but sold property. So you could argue that that is a misallocation of resources, and that is also another form of, say it with me, market failure. Okay? Let's move on to another point. So another thing that these countries with current account surpluses and trade surpluses, another thing they can do is they can use that extra foreign currency to build up their reserves. Let's talk about that in the context of Germany and the eurozone. Germany loves to save, and that creates excess savings. I think its marginal propensity to consume is about 0.22, which is very low. All right, it's out of 1. So they like saving. So they like using foreign currency to build up their reserves. But that's not good for other countries in the eurozone. Other struggling countries like Greece, which has a persistent trade deficit. All right? Germany has a persistent trade surplus. Part of the reason for that is it has very, very competitive exports. So, let's first talk about how this affects the euro. If Germany has super competitive exports, that's going to appreciate its currency. Remember, all countries in the eurozone have the same currency, the euro. So Germany's competitive exports appreciate the euro, price of exports increases, value of export decreases, price of imports decrease, value of imports increase. So net exports decreases, aggregate demand decreases, etc., etc., etc. So Germany's competitive exports actually depresses demand and growth for the other eurozone countries. That negative consequence would be offset if Germany used the extra foreign currency it has to buy imports from the countries in the European Union and the eurozone. So it could buy imports from Greece, which would level out Greece's trade deficit. It could use that to invest more into Greece. So with Greece having a current account deficit, it could run a financial account surplus. If countries with current account surplus like Germany invest into countries with a current account deficit like Greece, all right? Because that means that they need to fund it somehow. They need extra foreign currency to fund that current account deficit. So countries like Germany can invest abroad instead of building up their reserves into Greece, so FDI flows, for example, and that would be beneficial. That would be beneficial for growth in the eurozone as a whole. But what Germany is doing is it's using that extra foreign currency to build up its reserves, so we don't have that positive effect. All right? And so what that does is it depresses demand for the eurozone as a whole, and it's very bad for struggling countries like Greece. So that's the main argument that critics of Germany and Germany's current account surplus have against it. Let's look at a few evaluation points. The US and China trade war. They're having talks about it. It's not going anywhere. So an evaluation of an evaluation right there for you. The London UK asset bubble and the housing market, and also the eurozone. Let's talk about how global imbalances may actually be good for countries. All right, specifically looking at developmental economics, because most of your evaluation is really going to be there. For least developed countries, LDCs, and developing economies, like specifically sub-Saharan African countries, okay, their economies are not as developed as say the West. They usually have a current account deficit, or at least a trade deficit. So what happens there is, although they have significant global imbalances with developed countries like the US and say the UK, or even China, well, China is developing, but China has a current account surplus. Let's look at China again. But even companies within the UK and the US, they're relevant to what I'm about to say. Although these developing countries and the sub-Saharan African countries have global imbalances with other countries, in one part of the balance of payments, the current account, they could run a financial account surplus. Because if you remember from my first video, if you haven't watch it, alright? If you have a deficit in one part of the balance of payments, there's got to be a surplus in another part of the balance of payments. So if countries have a current account deficit, they're likely to have a financial account surplus. By receiving FDI flows and capital investment from abroad, from countries like China. Okay? Countries like China may run a financial account deficit because of all the investment outwards into other countries. So we have imbalances here, but those imbalances are somewhat supporting or complementing each other. So it's not that significant in this case, and it's actually quite beneficial. Another evaluation, I think it's a weak one, but if the deficit or the surplus is not that big, doesn't matter that much. It's a weak evaluation. Anyway, this has been the Awesome Tutor. Bye.